welcome to week 2. The good news is there is a week 2, and nobody sent a nasty email to Pastor Matt, and I got fired. So that's the good news. The bad news is I've got 3 more chances to make you all send that email that you don't want to send. I want to start off tonight just sort of refreshing our minds on what we covered last week, but before that, a bit of housekeeping. First, a correction. I was wrong about who the composer of the Lord of the Rings soundtrack was. That is, of course, Howard Shore, who wrote the compositions for That Thing You Do. Come on, great movie. Panic Room, Gangs of New York, The Departed, Spotlight, tons of others. The second thing, as a confirmation, yes, Malachi, it is the last book of the Old Testament. I don't know why I had a brain fart. And then third, Matt Brain, the reason that you prayed is because you asked this ridiculous question of who's the old dude in the Old Testament that didn't die. Matt, I believe, said Enoch. I said Elijah.
It's both.
It's both. We were both right. However, we were also both wrong because there is Melchizedek, who, if you wanted to deep dive into serious nerd stuff, word study and on that guy, Melchizedek. So last week we talked about 5-act story structure to the entirety, Genesis 1, Revelation 21, and we covered it in 30 minutes, and I couldn't believe that we did it. So we talked about kingdom perfection, kingdom disruption, struggle, inauguration, and restoration. If you remember, we talked about kingdom perfection and how the Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3 story was sort of like this protest literature that was flying in the face of the creation myths of the time. This was them getting the story right. This is Bono, for those of you that don't remember from last week. This is the, hey, we're Charles Manson stole this song from the Beatles. We're stealing it back. This is Genesis 1. Genesis 3. Oh, let me go ahead and put that guy there. For last week that you saw that, this was our inciting incident. This was kingdom disruption. This is sin entering into the story, right? So we got that. Kingdom perfection, kingdom disruption. Then we have basically the entirety of the Old Testament. Then we have 57 years of Will Ferrell until Jesus shows up on the scene. Everyone tracking? Yes? Lots of nodding heads. Good. And then lastly, we have the church age, which is where we exist today in 2024. We live between Jesus and the full restoration of his kingdom, the full recreation. And so we live in that already but not yet territory. Nodding heads, yes, good. Ultimately, we talked about what is our narrative as Christians. This is it. Jesus is Lord. So all other identities, all other theological leanings, all other sexual preferences, political parties, everything falls under this banner. Yes? Fantastic. So, where we're at today. That was very much the story of God in a crash course. We talked about these first 2 weeks are going to be kind of a diagnosis of kind of where we are as Christians in 2024 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then we're going to sort of apply how we got to where we are to these 2 giant buckets of kingdom sexual formation and kingdom political formation. So we talked last week about the story of God and how that is basically talking about the nature of God and his goals for humanity. Today, we turn the camera a little bit towards us. We turn that selfie switch on and we take a look at us. And we talk about the story of us and really the nature of humanity. And so really for the next 30, 40 minutes, we're going to try to do a crash course on roughly the last 400 years. We did eternity past to eternity future last week. We should be able to cover 400 years, right? So this week we're going to zoom in on really kind of, like I said, the last 400 years. But before we do that, I think we have to have, before we get into really this week and really the next 2 weeks, we kind of have to talk about culture. And so I kind of said that, that culture is this idea of what is human nature. And so our big question for the week is when we talk about the word or the idea of culture, what do we mean? We live in a time of culture wars, culture warriors, Southern culture, Northern culture, Republican culture, left culture, everyone has a culture. What does this word mean? So again, just to remind you, I'm entirely okay with awkward silences. This is a genuine question. What do we mean when we use the word culture?
Say what's generally accepted and even valued within a group of people.
It's great. Fantastic. Anyone else? It's a weird word. It's like something that we all use. We know what it describes, but it's hard to describe that word. Say what?
Who we are.
Who we are? Yeah.
The environment we surround ourselves.
It's good.
Way of doing things.
Way of doing things.
Our collective lifestyle.
Ooh, look at you. It's good.
The unspoken rules of a community.
Ooh, look at that.
That's
Now we're
good.
getting somewhere. We're cooking with gas now. Anybody else? So, unfortunately, I'm from the future, and I've cheated. So what is culture? This is going to be our working definition for tonight. Culture is the beliefs, behaviors, values, language, intellectual achievement, artistic expression, an entire way of life of a particular group of people. It is derived from the original word colere, meaning to plow or till. It was used to denote the cultivation, care, and tending of plants and animals. So we get a word picture in the root word there, and we actually get a really good picture of that in Genesis 1, 26 through 28. Anyone have a Bible on them? Yes. Can you look up Genesis 1, 26 through 28, and maybe read it out for us? I have the New American Standard Version up here, but I would love to hear another version if we can. Let's have it.
1:26.
Yes, ma'am.
Then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground." Oh.
Give me 27 and 28 as well.
So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground."
It's good. Anyone have like an old, something with thou or thee in it? No? Okay, we'll consult Eugene Peterson here. I'm going to skip down. God spoke, "Let us make human beings in our image, make them reflecting our nature so that they can be responsible for the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the cattle, and yes, earth itself, and every animal that moves on the face of the earth." God created human beings. He created them God-like. Reflecting God's nature, he created them male and female. God blessed them. Prosper, reproduce, fill the earth, take charge. Be responsible for fish in the sea and birds in the air, for every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. So when we're talking about culture, what we get in verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." This is where Christian theologians derive this idea of the cultural mandate. And so this quote from Nancy Pearcey really starts to unpack sort of the dual nature of this. In Genesis, God gives us what we might call humanity's first job description. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. The first phrase, be fruitful and multiply, means to develop the social world, build families, churches, schools, cities, governments, laws. The second phrase, subdue the earth, means to harness the natural world. Plant crops, build bridges, design computers, compose music. This passage is sometimes called the cultural mandate because it tells us that our original purpose was to create culture, to build civilizations, nothing less. And so this whole idea of God giving man a job description. Last week we talked about how work wasn't a consequence of the fall, right? Work shows up. What we just read was in Genesis 1, not after Genesis 3. When sin enters the world, right? So God gave us a job to do, and it is to cultivate the earth, but it's also to serve God through our work, bringing his kingdom reality to earth. So we're called to really transform the raw material of creation, and you can kind of find that in all kinds of different areas of life. You can find it in music. I'm secretly a symphony guy. Don't tell my wife, but I mean, getting dressed up, putting on a tie, showing up, and just the orchestra striking up, does something to you, right? This is also culture. Rocketry, space exploration. How cool is it that God planted us on one small sandbox of the universe. And he's like, man, when they figure out there's other stuff out here, it's going to be awesome. Right? Like, how cool is that? We are figuring out ways for rockets to go up and come back down and land in a different spot, and we can reuse them. That's amazing. Sports. Single greatest basketball player of all time. Get out of here with your LeBron talk, right? This is an amazing way that we express ourselves through competition as humans. Architecture. We don't have to build buildings like this, but there's something in us that has to express something, right? This is the Guggenheim. This is a museum. Unbelievable. Arts and sculpture. I zoomed in on the non-penis part of the statue of David here. But I do want to point out, like, just look at the detail. Like, he sculpted veins. Like, how amazing is that? There's the famous quote from, oh my gosh, Michelangelo. The whole idea of, like, David was in the block the whole time. I just had to chisel away what wasn't him, what wasn't there. Like, there's no other creature on the that we know of in the universe that does these sorts of things. And so the best way to drive out a bad worldview is offering a good one. But as Christians, we have to move beyond criticizing culture and into creating culture. And so there's a real danger in what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about sexual formation, what we're going to talk about in political formation, that it comes across that Christians were just out, standing outside just throwing stones at culture. That is not what we're called to do, right? Like, we're here to participate in culture. Our goal is to move into culture, politics, business, education, finance, whatever sphere of influence you have. It's to move into those areas of life as kingdom people. Amen? Okay. So I will say, what we're going to talk about tonight really sort of connects with last week. And I'm just going to read this. Every system of thought begins with some ultimate principle or meta-narrative. If it doesn't begin with God, it will begin with some other dimension of creation. The material, spiritual, biological, philosophical, empirical, etc. And so what story you believe and where you see yourself within that story matters. Because if your story doesn't begin with God, it's going to begin with something other than God. And so what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of secularism, individualism, postmodernism, we're going to talk about what happens when you start a story with something other than God, namely yourself. So we're in a struggle between God's narrative with God at the center and my narrative with self at the center. And so this idea of putting self at the center of the narrative is a really good shorthanded way of describing secularism. So let's talk about secularism, or the disenchantment of public space. That is a $10 definition for a $40 word that really nobody really understands but likes to throw around, the word secularism. And so I think it's one of those boogeyman words that people use when in reality they don't know what they mean. This is an old movie reference for anyone under 30 that doesn't understand this. This was from The Princess. Please, somebody raise a hand that doesn't know this movie. Oh, thank goodness. Oh no, fish! We were so close to 100%. Okay, that's all right. Well, secularism, as it was kind of let's go ahead and call it a political thought, came about during the Enlightenment as a reaction to just a ton of religious wars in Europe that sort of raged during the Middle Ages. And so what secularism attempted to do was to carve out a public space where religion was not the dominant determining factor. And so basically you can think about it as ripping out the operating system of religion and installing a new operating system of the Enlightenment. So reason, logic, the scientific method, all of those sorts of things are what sort of not filled the vacuum. It was very intentional. And so basically what happened was, like, great, if we figure out a way as a society to stop having all of these religious wars, then humans can progress. What's holding us back right now is Protestant versus Catholic, Christian versus Muslim. And so there was this idea that religion basically was insufficient common ground. It was actually detrimental to human progress. That is sort of what's happening in and around the 16th, 17th, 18th century. So think Enlightenment. So one of the byproducts of that was this division between public and private. This graphic is going to show up next week and the week after. Bank on it. Because what happened is when you start dividing things, when you start separating things into public, private, or mind and body, which we'll talk about next week, or other things, you start losing a holistic narrative of what life looks like. The other byproduct of this is the public square became theoretically neutral. And what I mean by that was, if we could just if you could imagine like a town square, right? Like there's a fountain in the middle and kind of thing, and people come together, and there's a farmer's market. It's really nice. If we could keep religion out of all of that, humans can flourish. Humans can progress. That was the thinking. Well, what happens? We have this secular myth that develops. And this is a quote from Mark Sayers, which if last week was, all stolen from the Bible Project, this week is all stolen from Mark Sayers. So the secularist myth centers on the idea that at some undetermined high point of church influence, the West was thoroughly Christian. It is imagined that at this high point, churches were filled with devoted believers and society was filled with Christians, Christian values and institutions. This period of strength is usually envisioned as occurring during the Middle Ages, a pinnacle from which the Christian faith has since experienced a decline. Great quote, don't really follow it. Here's a graph that helps make it sense, right? So this idea that sometime in the Middle Ages, think castles and feudal systems and all that sort of stuff, like everybody was Christian, right? And everyone went to Mass, and it was in Latin, and nobody understood it, but everyone was devout, right? Well, then over time, the Enlightenment happens, grunge music happens, 9/11 happens, and just this downward decline of faith and belief, right? And this is generally like a street-level understanding of how faith and belief has declined over the last 400-600 years. Now, what happens is this secularist myth assumes that we're going to progress eventually towards human perfection, human utopia, whether that's through technology, whether that's through education, that this idea that with the right types of conditions and influence, humans are perfectible, that we will eventually no longer have wars, right? Well, that only happens as religion, faith, superstition declines. We can't have both, is what secularism says. And so when this understanding, faith is seen, like I said, as something that holds human progress back. Does this track with everyone? Does this make sense? Okay, good. Here's the problem. In this secular vision, cultural progress replaces God's presence as the engine of history. So what happens is, in this secularist point of view, we seek to get all of the fruits of God's kingdom without bending the knee to the king, right? We want all of the good things that we find in Revelation 21, justice, peace, prosperity, redemption, right? But we don't want to have an author to the arc of history, right? And so all of this is really just an attempt to create a system of human flourishing that doesn't have to have an author, that doesn't have to have a definitive overarching narrative. And so in effect, if you think about it, it's basically a reach back to what Adam and Eve did in Genesis 3, right? And so they chose you could almost say they chose their own human-powered vision of what the good life is versus submitting to God, right? And so when you do that, you find yourself in a really lonely place because you sever sort of your relationship with God. And so that's really sort of what we've done over the past, like I said, 400-600 years, which leads us into postmodernism. Now, to understand postmodernism, this one is a little bit more difficult. To understand postmodernism, you really kind of have to break down secularism in a really sort of gnarly way. In secularism, like I said, somewhere around the Enlightenment, you start to see people moving away from the feudal system. They're leaving their family of origin and moving into cities. Well, what do people find in cities? They find a lot of anonymity, and they find a lot of loneliness, right? And so I'm going to jump down here. So in an attempt to sort of reconstruct meaning, in an attempt to sort of reconstruct all of those familial ties, they develop what historians call mediating institutions. So if you can think of it like in the Middle Ages, there was this concept, this idea of a great chain of being, where basically you had God and like the king up here, right? And then you had like way down here, you had the individual, right? Well, somehow through the church, through your city, your state, like you were connected to God and the king through your family, through all sorts of stuff. Well, what happens is people start to move out of that feudal system and into cities. That great chain of being gets absolutely just shattered, right? And so people in cities start to develop these mediating institutions to sort of try to reconstruct that great chain of being, right? So basically what you see in secularism, at least early secularism, is people that are no longer defined by where they were from or who they were connected to. What we see in postmodernism is very much a continuation of that. And so we have in the 18th century, and then in about the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, we see this rise of something completely different than secularism. It takes on a completely different tenor. It basically gets on steroids, which were also big in the 80s. So what you see is a move away from these mediating institutions. So think of mediating institutions like Masonic lodges, Elks clubs, Lions clubs, junior leagues, bowling leagues, all of these sort of third place. They're not work, they're not home, but they're like a social group sort of thing. And all of those things really start to experience a massive amount of decline, of which church is definitely one of those. And so in the 1980s, you start to see just this real hard roll-off of participation in this. Well, why is that? Well, what we have is sort of a new wave of individualism, where if individualism in secularism was moving out of the feudal system and into cities, the individualism that we see in postmodernism is a move away from those mediating institutions, and where they find themselves, we find ourselves, is in isolation, right? So how do we reconstruct meaning? In secularism, we made these mediating institutions. In postmodernism, consumption, consumerism. So no longer were you defined by sort of where you were from or who you were associated with. In postmodernism, you're no longer defined by any group identity, which means you have no commitments to anything. This is why it's really hard to get people to volunteer for childcare in our age, right? You talk to my parents' generation, you talk to my grandparents' generation, volunteerism was something that was just baked in. I'm nodding head here. It was just baked in, not in our generation. So what you see in secularism was sort of a disenchantment of life via politics. We ripped out religion, we installed politics. In postmodernism, we've ripped out politics, we've inserted economics. I could probably do another 6 weeks just on economic orders. We won't get there. But does this sort of arc make sense, right? Okay, good. So the only way that I can actually describe this better is through gangster films, right? Which, theology of The Godfather, sign me up. So what you have in The Godfather, who has not seen The Godfather? Okay, Fish, don't feel so bad now. I'm kidding. So, okay, The Godfather. It is basically centered around the Corleone family that, or collection of families that have immigrated to the United States from Sicily, and they, institute a mafia organization here in the United States. This is sort of the story of their familial ties, their really thick relationships. These are, brother and brother, father and son. The whole first half hour of the first Godfather is one wedding scene, right? So we're starting off with relationships. Now, you could argue that the mafia was kind of a mediating institution for these people, that they have this immigrant experience from Italy to the United States. What do? Right? Well, they fall into the old patterns that they had when they were, in Sicily. The mafia, the mob, right? And so there's lots of meals. There's lots of meetings around tables. Like I said, the first 30 minutes is a wedding. And during the wedding, you have people coming to Don Corleone, the head boss, and saying, hey, Don, do this favor for me. I've been wronged in this way. Can you make it right? I've gone to the police. They can't help me. Can you make it right? And so you have this series of people trotting in to Don Corleone, to their mediating institution, and saying, I can't get relief. Can you help make it right for me as an individual, right? So what we see is, like I said, a deep-knitted world of really, really thick relationships and thick ties. You contrast that with another gangster movie, Heat, 1994, 95. Michael Mann. This is not the mob. This is a collection of mercenary individuals in Los Angeles. And so you kind of learn some of their background, but honestly, it's irrelevant. Nobody cares. It's a group of people that really kind of don't even like each other. They come together for one goal, and that's to rob banks. Profit. Economics, right? So where we had politics, the life of the city, the life of the family, now we have economics. Right, so again, you get to know these bank robbers. There's a cop. There's the ringleader of the gang. By the way, Al Pacino and Robert De Niro in both movies, Godfather and Heat. Whatever conspiracy theory you want, that's fine. But the whole thing of this is it's not about family, right? This is individuals coming together for a short period of time, and really it's the story of disconnection and breakdown of relationships. Like I said, De Niro is the head of the bank robbing gang, and Al Pacino is the cop that's chasing after him. And they have a few run-ins and a few conversations. And at one point in the movie, there's this really famous quote where Robert De Niro's character, Neil McCauley, I believe, says to the cop, "Don't have anything in your life that you can't walk out on in 30 seconds or less if you feel the heat coming, if you feel police coming." This is low commitment. And the end of the movie is Robert De Niro, he has this giant sort of mental sort of wrestling match where he sees this woman, his girlfriend, and he also sees Pacino coming around the corner to come get him. What does he do? He walks away. So he walks out on this relationship that he thought he had and he thought was important to him, but that code of his, don't have anything in your life that you can't walk out on in 30 seconds or less, he lives up to it. This is one of probably the first true postmodern sort of movie where the thrust of it is Michael Mann, the director, saying this is the mantra that I'm seeing in culture right now. Don't commit to anything. Don't get too close to anything. Don't submit to anything. All that does is limit your ability to self-express. Now, if that self-expression takes on bank robbing, or if it takes on any other sort of cultural clothes, it doesn't matter. You should not limit yourself from self-expressing. Does this make sense? Okay, the Godfather helped. Good. So we're going to sketch out some implications of postmodernism. Postmodernism argues that there are no overarching stories that give meaning to life or absolute truth. So postmodernism claims there's no meta-narratives, that you, as an individual, are the one writing your narrative. So where secularism sort of told you to keep religion to yourself, postmodernism argues that you yourself are in fact religion. So it's our cultural norm, where we live today in our social location, to reject any overarching meta-narrative, and yet our primary identity as citizens of the kingdom of God are defined by the story of God outlined in what we talked about last week. This is why, hopefully, you start to feel homeless in culture. Is you have this overarching narrative, you have a way to imbue meaning into your life, and you live in a culture that does not understand that. That not only doesn't understand it, but is pretty actively opposed to it. So whereas in secularism, the town square was meant to be neutral, our town square, where we live in postmodernism, is not neutral. It is actively opposed to anyone making any sort of narrative claim. So, who gets to define what's right in this world, in this postmodern society? Who gets to decide what's right, what's true? If there's no overarching story or author, where is this whole thing headed? Who gets to define this? Well, I would say that if I could sum up secularism and postmodernism in two little slogans, because it's what I do for a living, secularism is you do you. How many times have everyone heard that? Second wave individualism, postmodernism, is not you do you, it's speak your truth. So, we have in late stage secularism this idea of you can do, think, believe, pray whatever you want as long as it doesn't sort of interact or hurt anyone. Late stage postmodernism, which I would say we're probably mid to late stage, says I'm not being my authentic self if I'm not expressing it for everyone else to experience. So this is how we end up with expressive individualism. Whew, this is a whole other kettle of fish here. I will try to sum up expressive individualism. If we have sort of, individualism classic in secularism, we've got new individualism in postmodernism, we've got like individualism on steroids here towards the end of postmodernism. And basically it says the individual is king. The individual can reject any notion of external authority or meaning to conform and make him or herself the creator of meaning. Where the inner psychological life of the individual is king and sovereign, then identity becomes as potentially unlimited as the human imagination. This is where we start to have major identity issues. And when, you start to see some of these things pop up in things that we'll talk about next week in sex. We'll talk about this in politics the fourth week. But personal authenticity is only found by rejecting outward definitions and beginning to publicly display your inward desires. So in this sort of era of postmodernism that we live in, I think one of our most powerful desires is sexual. And so if you take this expressive individualism and layer sex on top of that, you get an area where sex and identity become the same thing. Where who you are and your sexual preferences are indivisible. That is not what we get from the story of God, right? So, we're ultimately left with, okay, who gets to define what's right? Who gets to define what's wrong? Nobody does. You just have to express yourself. You're not being true to yourself if you don't go within yourself to find yourself, your authentic self, and then once you do, express that. Well, now you're confronted with other questions. Well, does this make me happy? Does it harm somebody else? Does it feel right? Do I believe in my heart that this is right and authentic for me? I really don't care about anybody else. So ethics, therefore, becomes a function of feeling. And ethics are built upon a subjective, emotional foundation. And really, any form of restraint has become oppressive. I wish we could get into sort of victim and oppressor, but we won't be able to maybe in the fall. So, what we're left with at the end here of individualism, expressive individualism, late stage postmodernism is who defines what is good and right? Well, when you become the God of your own world, I don't know about you, but I'm not that good at being God. And in my world, I'm left with dysfunction. This is Philip Reef. The culture with no sacred order has the impossible task of justifying itself only by reference to itself. So basically, do you remember trying vocabulary words in elementary school? And say your vocabulary word was ball, right? And you couldn't come up with a way to describe ball, and you end up going, it's a ball, right? That's kind of what Philip Reef is saying, is that when you have no external definition or validation, you're just going to be stuck in dysfunction. And that is very much what we see today. Okay, wow, Jonathan, that's pretty bleak. I've got worse news. If we're going to stand outside culture and we're going to, sort of try to inspect, the speck in culture's eye, I think we would be doing it a service if we didn't at least think that there might be some possible chance that secularism and postmodernism has had an effect on the church. So I think it's our job to be honest with ourselves and say, at this point, I think it's pretty clear that instead of being a culture shaper, the church has been informed, at least, by secularism and postmodernism. And so what that looks like, if I were to sketch that out over, in the last 100 years or so, we start to see kind of these 7 beats happen. If you go back to the first and second Great Awakening, think late 1800s, early 1900s, you start to see really big sweeping changes in how people sort of perceive faith and church. This is tent revival meetings. These are things happening outside of church walls, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We wouldn't think anything of that. But then you also start to see a focus, because of those tent revivals, on intense emotional conversion experiences, and even conversion at the expense of discipleship. And so as a consequence, a knock-on consequence of the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, which were great things to happen in this country, but one of the knock-on effects was this idea that our job as Christians and our job as the church is to get as many people to say the sinner's prayer as possible, not to apprentice themselves and their lives to Jesus. Christ-likeness, becoming an apprentice to Jesus was sort of put on the back burner. It wasn't you don't need to do that. It was no, you need to have this conversion experience first, and then we can talk about this other stuff. But why don't you go out and get other people to pray the sinner's prayer while you're at it, right? So part of what happens is there's this removal of, or demotion of, the mental component to a conversion experience with Jesus. And so what ends up happening is we start to develop this celebrity model of leadership with a focus on a preacher, speaker, influencer, entertainer. I shouldn't have to explain that. I think that's pretty evident in our culture today. Okay, good. I won't spend any time there. One of the next things that happened was there was this really deep suspicion of theological learning and a sort of anti-intellectualism that sort of snuck into the church and grew over time. And it was basically we'll focus on doing these really good productions, have these emotional experiences, and that'll be enough, right? When we couple that with this idea of you can just, as a 20th, 21st century Christian, very much removed from first century Jewish culture, that you can just straight up walk in on the Bible and just read it and know exactly what it means, is wild. We don't approach Shakespeare that way, right? Like we try to understand what was going on, during Shakespeare's time to understand the ideas that he's trying to get across. For some reason, we walked away from that when it comes to reading the Bible. So, the next idea. People began to focus on needs and preferences of the individual over the community and the idea that individual choice was the final determinant of belief. Who was a Christian who attended church in the 90s? I'll say that way. Anyone? Yes. Okay. Who remembers the contemporary / modern versus traditional worship experience argument / mild church splitting that happened? That is this. This is literally people going, I can't even stand to be in the same room as you when we're worshiping God because my preferences are different. That, folks, is postmodernism invading church culture in a major, major way. Last two. There's a growing tendency to ignore the historical traditions of the church. We became anti-creedal. We became anti-historical. We didn't lose. We threw out nearly 2,000 years of unbelievably important Christian church thought. We somehow, to quote C.S. Lewis, became chronological snobs. This idea that we're the ones figuring out the answers to all of these questions. No one else has ever asked these questions before when it comes to sex or politics or anything. So what do I do? Well, I'll make up the truth. I'll find the truth myself. We just did away with 2,000 years of cultural critique, cultural thought, Christian theology. And so no wonder we feel completely alone. No wonder we feel completely lost, even as Christians. We've lost that giant church age part of our story, right? So, last one. Ultimately, the church withdrew from intellectual encounters with the secular world and gave up the idea that Christianity gives a comprehensive framework to interpret all of life and scholarship. We basically said, you're right, secularism, we'll just be over here. Thank you very much. So, we have those things invading modern evangelicalism, the church, particularly in the United States over the last 100 years. And so basically what you find is postmodernism relentlessly undermining the foundations of meaning. It creates an inner emptiness, an inner life in constant need of repair and salvation. And that somehow latched onto Christian evangelicalism in this country and created something that Matt and I like to call Christianity as lifestyle management. We became consumers as Christians. So, what does that look like? Lifestyle management. And tell me if this rings true or false. Basically, it's your job as a Christian to look within yourself. We're born innocent, happy, whole. Our inner child, our inner self is good. And your job is not to conform to any external restrictions, because those give us low self-esteem. We have to throw off all authority. We have to escape from these external restrictions. We can't even have... the dwindling of denominations in this country speaks to this. Pastors can't even have authority anymore. They have to run their own show, right? And then lastly, pursue pleasure. Find it whenever, wherever you can find it. And if I can find that in church, great. What that ultimately leads to is this. You have an endless supply of freedom and options coupled with low levels of responsibility, low levels of relational commitment, and ultimately that puts you in a really spiritually precarious place. If I were to say, let's just take this and apply it to fill in the blank, any pastor that's had a moral failure in the last, 10 minutes. I guarantee what you'll find is a low level of relational commitment. He's isolated himself. He or she has isolated themselves. They have pushed off tons of their responsibility as the leader of the flock of their church onto church staff. And now they're left with endless freedom and options. And they found themselves in a spiritually precarious place where it's really hard to say no to your desires, whatever it is that you want. So, what do we do about this? In order to form a Christian worldview, we have to overcome this divide of sacred and secular, private and public, mind and body, which we'll talk about next week, right? And we've got to reject the tendency to divide our lives into all these little separate compartments. And so this is a lot of the reason why churches are sort of losing their influence, losing their witness, losing sort of the prophetic voice that we can add to culture. And we say, hey, yeah, I'm a Christ follower, but Jesus really doesn't have any bearing on my politics. Hey, I go to church, but I also want to have sex with whoever I want to have sex with. I'm a scientist, but sometimes, I've figured out a way to compartmentalize my life where my faith doesn't interfere with my job. So, Christians have to find a way to overcome this divide by demonstrating to the world that a Christian worldview does offer a whole and integrated truth that is not oppressive, but leads to freedom and life as God intended or created. So next week, we're going to look at a lot of this as it relates to our sexual formation. So when we do those things, we're able to move from a lifestyle management approach to something a little bit more like this, a biblical worldview. So we move from looking within ourselves to having God define our story. We recover our story, which is holistic, and it leads to truth and speaks to the entirety of life. Instead of, worrying about conforming, we form ourselves by the Spirit. Please watch Pastor Rachel's spiritual formation on YouTube. It is vital. Instead of throwing off authority, we submit ourselves willingly. We live in light of the cross, laying down our lives, idols, and desires, no matter what they are. And then lastly, instead of pursuing pleasure, we live on sacrificial mission. We join God in his mission to bring his kingdom to earth to redeem all of creation. And where that ultimately lands us is no longer this, but this. We have a biblical worldview that is informed by the Word, that is led by the Spirit, and is for the world. That's what vital Christianity in a postmodern context actually looks like. So, Pastor Matt snuck in while no one was watching. Questions? The first 5 are going to you, Matt.
You mentioned something about the church removing intellectualism or something, or you said like anti-intellectualism. And I think I want to just clarify, like, in some ways, is that a bad thing? Because there are a lot of people in this world who aren't able to process information very well.
100%.
So when you say that, are you just talking about like the essence? Like,
Yeah.
what do you mean by that?
So the church, Pastor Matt talks about this a lot. We find ourselves in ditches, and to get out of one ditch, we go to another ditch. And in the Middle Ages, medieval times, you could almost say it was all intellectualism and no emotion, where services were conducted in Latin and nobody knew what the heck was going on. Nobody knew what we were talking about. It was illegal for priests and bishops to conduct mass in the cultural language. Crazy, right? Then what did we do? We found ourselves in another ditch where liturgy has no place, where critical and study of literary design of the Bible has no place. Everything is extemporaneous. Everything has to come from the heart. We've just found ourselves in another ditch. And I think that's one of the things that I so appreciate about Matt's leadership and how we've really sort of architected our services, our Sunday morning gatherings, because I got to be honest, as you can tell, I'm probably not an emotional guy. I probably lean more towards the intellectual side. Worship, great. Once every 6 months for me, right? But I tell you, every week that we do the table liturgy and the giving liturgy, it does something in me. We have to have both. It's not one or the other. It's not one versus the other. We have to have both. And so I think what we have to do in the cultural location that we find ourselves in right now is reach back and grab some of that critical thought, that intellectualism, not letting go of the emotional experiences in that, because we need both. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's great. Yeah, I'm actually going to allude to that this Sunday in part of my message of just every time the church did, overcorrect at times and something was lost. And it's always about trying to recover those things. And, over the last few hundred, actually the last couple of decades, I think this was in the notes, there were several things that were lost. We unhitched ourselves from church tradition because we thought, who needs that? We're just going to experience Jesus in a new way. You can't unhitch yourself. That's what keeps us orthodox, and that's what keeps us down the path. And it's not even that every single individual needs to give themselves over to deep theological study, but as a whole, we have scholars and people who help us navigate in this culture of what is orthodox and what is right. And that's what church tradition helps us do. We need that. If we went to any time and place in church history the last 2,000 years and that was removed, the church would lose their way. And at times they did anyway.
Yeah.
Right? So we need those individuals who are committed to scholarship, committed to intellectualism. That's a key piece.
You can almost view it through a lens of gifts. I mean, what does Paul say? Some are given the gift of teaching. Some have gifted in tongues. We've over-rotated on one certain set of gifts. We have to have the other gifts to balance the body out.
Yeah. I don't think, City Church, I'm not saying that we are the perfect model or have it all right, but I will say what we've tried to do is, what are these streams of Christianity, what are the strengths and how do we take, we're pretty unique in that. There's not a whole lot of churches that are charismatic Pentecostal but at the same time liturgical.
Pastor Matt's secretly Anglican. Nobody knows
absolutely. I'm not a secret anymore. I'm very open about that. I grew up Assemblies of God. I'm still credentialed through the Assemblies of God, and yet I would probably be an Anglican if I had to choose, which is really weird, because I think we need to experience God and the power of God in new ways, but we have to be anchored in something, right? I'm about to start my doctorate in spiritual formation because I feel like spiritual formation for me is, I grew up, we experienced God, but we had nothing to root us and anchor us. And I think spiritual formation would be what God's called me, the most significant contribution I can make to the kingdom, is in that area, which is neglected. With me growing up, let's just experience God again and that'll be enough, but it wasn't. It wasn't enough, Anyway.
Great question. Yeah.
The liturgy is all new to me. So where does that come from? Is that from Scripture? Or where do we get the liturgies from?
Yeah, some of them are taken from we've taken all of them and kind of made them our own, but we take some of them from the Book of Common Prayer. We would do creeds and things like that, like the Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed. We haven't done that in a while. Mm-hmm. But more than anything, they're rooted in Scripture, but they just kind of root us every week. Okay. Right, in this kind of rhythm. And even more than anything, our centerpiece would be coming to the table. That is the key centering. And I'll just be honest with you, there's a lot of people, they leave every time in service. When we get to that, it's oh, that's the time to leave. I'm if you're ever not going to leave, that would be the moment to stay,
I had somebody come with church to us, come to church with us. Goodness, that was a mouthful. A couple months back, and afterwards, hey, what did you think? And all this stuff, and it was hey, it's really, really cool, really good. If you move that table out, you could fit 50 more chairs in there. And I was like, Pastor Matt would literally flip a table instead of doing away with that part of the service, because I've heard you say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but worship's great. Message is cool. The table is the most essential thing that we do on a Sunday morning.
Well, I'd say 7 or 8 years ago, I thought to myself, what's the one thing that every person who comes to a service at City Church, they need to experience Jesus. They need to come, and that's what we do at the table. It's centering our life on that. So worship's great, a sermon's great, all those things, fellowship, all this part of it. I don't want you to leave without that opportunity to come and allow Jesus to transform your life. And that's what the early church did for hundreds of years. And that's what rooted them and kept them, unified when they had nothing else in common. And so, that's a practice.
For me, the liturgy stuff, it's very akin to worship music. I mean, it's repetitive, it's all the things, but for me, that is the anchor that I come back to every week. And Matt may preach amazing messages. For whatever reason, Spirit might not speak to me in anything that he says. But a line that I've repeated now several hundred times on a Sunday morning might jump out to me in a new way based upon the week that I just had. And I think not having that opportunity is something that we miss by not having sort of that liturgical muscle as part of the body.
Yeah. Part of you guys already know this, but part of the struggle is that we got so accustomed to entertainment within church. And we don't want to step out of our seats and get up because I came here just to sit and watch you. And that's uncomfortable for me. Yeah. And you know what? Yeah, we got so ingrained in that now you do anything like repetitions, you're like, oh, this again. Guess what? You come to the table every week and sometimes you feel nothing. And sometimes you don't even know what's working. And then you come to the table and God reveals.
And sometimes it's not even the liturgy itself, it's the act of the liturgy. Again, my wife and I, we typically sit towards the front. We, got late or, showed up in the back, one week. And if you sit in the back, you're waiting a while to walk up. And I was thinking like, God, there's got to be, because I serve on the communion team. I was like, there's got to be a way that we can make this more efficient. And literally, as I'm thinking that, I thought, that's not the point. Pragmatism, practicality, efficiency, those are not kingdom values. They're good things. Like I want services to flow well and be organized, but if those are our primary goals, we're missing it. Yeah. And so the act of waiting on my fellow brothers and sisters in the body of Christ is a very small, insignificant way that I can practice restraint, that I can lay down my preferences, that I can put others first. And so sometimes it's not even the actual liturgy, it's waiting in line to do the liturgy, right? So I think those types of things for me, when I say like go back and reach for intellectualism, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Not like, going off to a monastery and reading the Bible 12 times, by yourself. Maybe there's a place for that. I don't know, but
yeah, you don't do those things of liturgies and coming to the table every week to. It's not a church growth tactic. It's a formation thing. We did it because we want to form people, not because we want to entertain them or grow a big church. If it was about growth, we wouldn't do those things. If it was just about how many numbers, because there's plenty of people that come in and are like, I don't like getting up every week, and we're like, we're fine with that. But that's not going to change what we do.
It's not for you.
Yeah.
Right, because it's a forming practice, yeah. What else?
In the Nicene Creed, it talks about the Catholic Church, but how do we reconcile that with all these different modern denominations?
So big C, little c. Catholic means worldwide, global. It has come to mean, in our sort of modern parlance, the non-Protestant wing of Christianity, but that particular thing is in reference to Catholic meaning global church. Fair?
Yeah, it is. And just like anything else, what we just talked about ditches is, you guys know for centuries, and the Catholic Church began to abuse certain powers. There was need for reformation in the church. We came in, Martin Luther did his thing, and now there was no authority, overarching authority, and we have 1 million denominations. So we went from one pope, one leader, one denominations, to now, if I disagree with you about anything, I'm going to go start my own thing. Right? Both of them very detrimental. Yeah. I'm grateful for the Reformation. I think it was needed. In fact, I think we're in need of another one.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about that on Sunday too. Sunday's message is getting a little spicy.
Man,
Let's start out that way. It is. It's going to be a little different. I'm going to talk about narcissism in the church and some of the things that we need to do to help reform the church.
Reformation follow revival, because if you just have a revival and don't have Reformation,
Sure.
nothing changes.
Yeah.
There were significant reformations every 500 years in church history. Well, guess what? It's been since the last one.
499.
Bingo. Right? But yeah, now we have no overarching authority, and so we split off, every 4 seconds about everything. I don't think that was the design of what it should have been either. Right? So, what you have, Don?
Yeah, this was a really important critique of modernity and postmodernism. You described it as an infection for an antidote. But I'm curious if you can see gifts that we get from modernity and that we get from postmodernism that enriched our church that we don't want to throw out with the bathwater.
Yeah, I think I'll take modernity first, and maybe not secularism, but modernity. There was, I think we can all agree that the Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around, right? It wasn't called the Dark Ages for no reason. There was a tendency of the church to have the thumb on the scale, specifically as it relates to science. And the church needed reformation in that area. And so anytime that you find church and power very tightly aligned, beware. And in previous to modernity, church and power were very, very, very tightly aligned. And that needed fixing. And so I think to answer your question, just one example of that would be this idea came about that the church and science were opposed to each other, and that the church was every answer that you needed for life you could be found in the church. Well, that's not how church was supposed to. That doesn't reflect real life, right? Like, am I supposed to do this job or this job? I'm not going to come to you for that. That's not your job. You know what I mean? Like, but I say that to say, like, absolutely there were things that were good that came out of that. Overall, though, the thrust of modernity and postmodernism has been towards human progress without that presence of God. I think, again, ditches, right? Like, the church needs to be able to hold on to truth and grace, truth wherever it's found. I think it's Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, I don't know. All truth is God's truth. If it's true, guess where it came from? God, right? So I think that might be one way to answer that.
Yeah, I think it's good. I'm not going to add anything to that. I'm going to have some ideas, but me and you will talk about that. I'll let that be a 30-minute conversation between me and you.
Yeah, that's hard.
It's good question.
Anything else? Man, 4 minutes early.
That's right.
We did it.
Hey, I want to know, we put this class together back in 2020, I think, something like that.
2021.
2021?
Yeah.
But Jonathan has put a lot of time to take it to the next level. He's been, I know, staying up really late at night, getting home from work, doing all these things. So he's invested a lot of this. I just want you to know how much I appreciate it, because it's great stuff.
Any other questions? Like I said, next week we're going to take all of this story of God stuff, all of the story of us stuff, and shove it all through the lens of sex. And then same thing on week 4, we'll put it all through the lens of politics. I think next week will be PG-13. You all can drive. Facial hair, you're good.
Marriage class is also PG-13.
Yeah, there you go. I will send out last week's slide deck and this week's slide deck tonight before I go to sleep. See you guys next week.